Yeah, we're good?
We're good.
We're filming?
Do it.
All right, cool. Thank you for joining us. This talk I'm going to give to you, it's about an hour long. It's an overview of the concept being climate change risk disclosures on gas pumps. Sometimes people call them climate change warning labels or information labels. It's all the same thing. My name is Rob. I'm a lawyer and executive director of a climate change advocacy group, a nonprofit based in Toronto here in Canada. And this video is one that we're sending to politicians within Canada, but also we've had over the last several months volunteers go to government websites all around the world to copy and paste email addresses of politicians like yourself into this massive global database, and we're sending this email out to you to share this idea. Big picture, where do I think this idea sort of fits in overall into sort of accelerating this transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewables and clean technology and so on is this. So the sort of world as we know it, the sort of status quo that we all take for granted, a fossil fuel-based economy, it's completely normalized. There's a lot of systemic inertia to the status quo. So we're up against some deep cultural programming when it comes to transitioning to this alternative. And so there are people and businesses that are working on renewable technology, renewable energy, clean technology, and so on, places we can transition to. But it's tricky when you're up against the systemic inertia of the status quo, sort of the world as we know it today. So what this piece plays, climate change labels on gas pumps, is it sort of denormalizes a habitual, everyday, automatic behavior. And in doing that, and sort of disrupting the status quo, creating a broader sense of discomfort or dissatisfaction with it, it loosens the grip of the status quo, and it creates more space then for us to transition to this other place. So it then better accelerates the transition that we all need to undertake. So that's a bit of an overview. I'll dive into the idea. I'll share some of the theory and research behind it, and then I'll say how you can pursue it in your own community. Just one slide, a bit of a background around climate change first to ensure that we're all on the same page. It was in 2009 that the world met in Copenhagen for one of these international climate change conferences hosted by the United Nations every year. And one of the things that came out of that was this global consensus that we have to limit the temperature, the average temperature increase in the Earth since the Industrial Revolution to no more than 2 degrees Celsius. So we can't go over this 2 degrees Celsius figure. While that was the political consensus, a lot of scientists will say that figure is actually dangerously high, but nevertheless, that sort of remained the political consensus. A group of scientists then, they asked the question, so if we know there's this threshold that we can't exceed, how much more fossil fuels can we burn? So how much more carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases can we emit? And the figure they came up with was 565 gigatons worth of carbon dioxide. And I've seen figures that are slightly higher, slightly lower, and note that this figure is now already a few years old. The takeaway, though, is more conceptual. So in setting this sort of ceiling on temperature increase, working backwards from that, you're creating what many refer to as a carbon budget. So this is the amount of basically carbon, so coal, oil, natural gas, and so on, that we can continue to burn before we commit to that 2-degree temperature increase. The next figure I'll show you on this slide comes actually from a group of financial analysts who what they did is they said, okay, so we know how much we can burn, but how much is there left to burn? And to approximate that value, they opened up reports, annual reports of publicly traded companies that deal in fossil fuels and state-owned enterprises as well, and they added up proven reserves of these businesses. So that's the amount of coal and oil and natural gas that they've identified as being under the earth that they intend on extracting and bringing to market for us to use, for us to burn in a variety of ways. And they added up all of those values together to get a sense of global proven reserves. And the figure they came up with was 2,795 gigatons worth of carbon dioxide. And this sets up the story. This is kind of the problem that we find ourselves in, where this is the amount that we currently intend on burning, which is roughly 5 times sort of the safe or allowable limit. And so we need to transition away from fossil fuels to sort of avoid the worst. The chief economist of the International Energy Agency noted that if we carry out with the status quo business game plan, we're looking at a temperature increase of something in the range of 5 to 6 degrees Celsius. And for all intents and purposes, that's an entirely different planet. There's a lot of life on Earth that can't adapt to such a change in such a short time frame. Of course, those of you will know there's also ocean acidification, say. So our oceans absorb carbon dioxide. They become more acidic in the process. Our oceans, of course, are absorbing excess heat as well, so they're warming. There's a lot of marine life that won't be able to adapt as well. So we need to avoid that. The update to the story, of course, comes out of Paris just a few months ago, where again the world met together for one of these conferences on climate change. COP21 is what it's called. And what came out of that was this sort of recommitment to this 2 degrees Celsius figure, but recognizing that this being more in line with science, this threshold of 1.5 degrees that we can't exceed, we sort of created this aspirational target. So we don't want to go over this figure. And you'll notice, care of my PowerPoint skills, look at that, wah, the thing shrinks, right? If you lower the ceiling on temperature increase, working backwards then, you're shrinking the size of the carbon budget. And I've seen some figures in terms of, well, what does this figure now become? One of the more interesting ones that I recently came across was from, I think it was Carbon Brief, looking at IPCC data, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says that we're basically, if we are consistent with our annual rate of emissions, we're basically going to burn through this in something like 6 years. And for those of you that have been keeping track, in the last few months, the average temperature that we've seen globally, we've actually, for the last couple months, exceeded that. So the moral of the story basically is we're running out of time to transition away from fossil fuels, and we really need to accelerate this transition. There's lots of good news, though. So what are people saying globally? We have leaders, like, for example, the President of the United States, who says, we're not going to be able to burn it all. I very much believe in keeping that 2 degrees Celsius target as a goal. He said this, of course, pre-Paris. But the point is, political discourse is now in this place where we're recognizing we're not going to be able to burn it all. We're going to have to leave some fossil fuels under the earth. From Canada, now Governor of the Bank of England, former Governor of the Bank of Canada, and economist Mark Carney, he says the vast majority of reserves are unburnable. One should think of them as stranded assets. Stranded in that they'll never make it to market. And just last year, this was in the spring or summer in Bonn, G7 leaders met in Germany, and they agreed to phase out fossil fuels to decarbonize the global economy in the course of this century. So while this timeline doesn't accord too well with the science, the interesting thing is we're talking about the end of fossil fuels. So there is hope in terms of people recognizing more and more the end of fossil fuels. But again, as I mentioned, there's this tremendous systemic inertia to the status quo, and that's where this idea comes in. So these labels would fit on a gas pump nozzle like this. And you'll notice, so this, you can think of this design as a bit of a template, right? So top half, an image to communicate an impact of climate change or air pollution. Then you could have a word like warning or caution or notice or information. And then you would have language that corresponds with that image to sort of communicate that particular impact of our use of fossil fuels. There would be a website hosted by whatever jurisdiction is passing this idea into law. And on that website, there will be a list of all of the various things that an individual can do to reduce their carbon footprint. And this, if you're interested in learning more about this, this is just an attribution. We have on our website a 40-page legal report that explores the rationale behind having that attribution there. You can also have maybe sort of a before and after thing. So this, of course, speaks to ocean acidification that I mentioned before. And this, it's interesting in terms of really localized impacts of burning fossil fuels. We inhale this stuff, and it's been known to cause respiratory problems, cardiovascular disease, certain types of cancers. A lot of people don't actually know that, and I think it's partly because this is just the world that we know. We take so much of it for granted. And in sort of communicating these hidden costs to end users, you're denormalizing the status quo, stimulating broader demand for reform. And I'll get into what that leads later. But of course, you also have this prompt to sort of maybe funnel dissonance to a website where people can take action in terms of reducing their own carbon footprint. The idea, it's been endorsed by academics, prominent academics actually, in universities across North America, several in Europe. You can go to our website to see the complete list. But names like James Hansen, Naomi Oreskes, Michael Mann, Catherine Potvin, and so on. So some of the more prominent climate scientists actually globally have supported this. And I think part of the reason anyway is because it's familiar. It's evocative of something that we already know and understand, the tobacco warnings that we see in many countries all over the world. People often ask me, well, do these things actually work? You know, my friend still smokes, therefore this thing doesn't work. And so, of course, that's just a sample size of one, right? You have to look at the studies. And the good news is there's lots of studies on this question of whether or not these sorts of labels work. It was 2001, actually, that Canada became the first jurisdiction in the world to require the visual warnings on tobacco packages. Since then, countries all over the world have adopted that, went from text only to the images. There's something like 70 countries in the world that have these. And it was in 2009 that the European Union commissioned a meta-study, so a study of studies, that included over 200 independent studies from all over the world that all tried to answer the question of whether or not these things work. And the overall conclusion was that yes, they do. They're great conduits to provide information, which is sort of obvious. But the other more interesting thing is they did find that it does actually result in changes in behavior. So for example, smoking less, quitting altogether, and so on. But perhaps more interesting, I think, and I think that this really speaks to the potential of this idea, is it resulted in a shift in attitudes that then enabled all sorts of other interventions. So look to the studies. The studies say that yes, these things do work. But I ask myself, you know, would tobacco companies fight against these sorts of measures wherever they pop up all over the world if they didn't have the potential to impact their bottom line? So would they spend resources fighting this thing, you know, if they were actually ineffective? And so I think the very fact that industry fights against them is sort of admission as to their own effectiveness. And you know, more generally, you could think of say the entire consumer packaged goods industry, where what they do is they tinker with a packaging's font and images and color and texture and shape and copy and so on. And they'll hire psychologists to do that, and they'll run focus groups. And they do all of that with the explicit purpose of influencing consumer attitudes and behavior. So of course, the way you package a product, the way you present a product, is necessarily going to affect the way that we as consumers perceive it. I think to suggest otherwise is sort of untenable. Now, there's a lot of interesting analogies between these two. There are some differences. But what I'm going to suggest to you, though, is actually forget about how it's kind of like cigarette packages, and let's consider this idea on its own merit. And there's a few reasons why I think it's a compelling intervention. So one, I like to say that climate change can be understood as a problem of no feedback. And what I mean by that is there's this delay between cause and effect. So we burn fossil fuels today, the consequences of which aren't experienced until tomorrow. And for those of you who are familiar with systems change, you'll understand that feedback is a critical component to systems change. The other thing worth noting, of course, is psychologists, they've identified something called the current moment bias, or hyperbolic discounting. And it's this idea that we as individuals, we tend to prefer interests that are small and near in time relative to those that are significant but far down the road. It's sort of why we procrastinate. And so what this idea does, quite simply, is just through the use of image and text, it brings those faraway consequences more into the here and now. So it actually takes a problem of no feedback and builds feedback, and it counteracts this thing that I mentioned called the current moment bias. Going back to Mark Carney, who I mentioned before, he refers to this sort of as the tragedy of horizons, and he was speaking about climate change when he said, it's the tendency of market actors to look only to the near term and not to the future. Now imagine if you could bring that future more into the here and now, how it might affect market actors. So that's sort of the business side of things that I'll get into. On the political side of things that I'll get into a bit more later, you have Barack Obama, who said on climate change, one of the hardest things in politics is getting a democracy to deal with something now where the payoff is long-term or the price of inaction is decades away. Imagine if you could bring that price of inaction that's decades away more into the here and now, How that then creates more political space gives someone like Barack Obama greater political capital to be able to introduce climate reforms A, B, and C, and so on. 2, I like to say that climate change can also be understood as a problem of diffusion of responsibility. So what I mean by that is I contribute a little bit to the problem. You contribute also just a little bit to the problem. My friend Stefan off screen, thank you for filming. He contributes a little bit to the problem as well. And as individuals, our contribution to the problem is small. But collectively, we know that we're altering the chemistry of our planet. Social psychologists know that when responsibility for something is diffuse, so when it's shared among many, we're actually less likely to act. And one of the more famous examples of that, it's a tragic story that comes out of New York. A woman by the name of Kitty Genovese, this was several decades ago, she was assaulted. And she was crying for help. And maybe 50, 60, 70 people, an entire apartment complex, an entire neighborhood heard her cries for help. But tragically, nobody responded. And why? That's because responsibility for intervention was diffuse. It was shared among many. Every single person thought, oh, well, surely someone else will call 911. And in the end, nobody did. And that story ends rather tragically. What's really, really interesting is in these sort of instances of assault, there's actually a greater likelihood of intervention if 2 or 3 people, so if a smaller number of people witness that assault, there's a greater likelihood of intervention in that scenario. And that's, of course, because concentration, rather in the latter scenario, responsibility is now sort of concentrated. And I sometimes draw the analogy to CPR. So if any of you have ever taken a CPR course, you know that if, say, poor Steven off screen were to drop and I'm administering CPR to him, I don't say, somebody, anybody, please call 911. You know, I say, you sir, or you ma'am, please call 911 and get back to me when you do. And the reason for that, of course, is in the former, responsibility for intervention is diffuse. People are actually less likely to do it. Everyone's kind of looking at each other. Whereas in the latter, responsibility's been concentrated. So you up the likelihood of response. And what this idea does, quite simply, is the placement of the label on the gas pump nozzle. It takes a problem of diffuse origins, and quite literally, it locates responsibility right in the palm of your hand. So again, we've got this sort of thing. It's a sticker. It's incredibly inexpensive, incredibly simple. I'm going to talk to you about it, for probably about a half hour more from now. But it actually addresses this aspect of human nature and this aspect of climate change. And I challenge you to think of anything like it out there that builds feedback in quite a direct way, or that sort of connects us to the impacts of our fossil fuel use in quite a direct way. And there's actually nothing out there like it. So I truly do think it will have an impact. Going to economics now. So of course, many of you will know that climate change can be characterized as this problem of negative externalities or hidden costs. And I like to illustrate this concept just by way of sharing an example. So let's say that a liter of gasoline costs $1.35 at the pump. In that price are a variety of costs that the producer had to incur in order to bring the product to market for us, the consumer, to consume. So there were some people, there was some labor. People expended some efforts that had to be paid for. There were some machines involved in that process that had to be paid for. Some energy went into that had to be covered. The product had to be shipped somewhere. It had to be refined, so the costs are going higher and higher. It had to be brought to an individual retailer. Of course, there's a profit margin on top of that. And there's taxes on top of that. So all of that goes to inform this $1.35 price. And that's sort of the signal to the marketplace of the value or the worth of the product. And economists will tell you that there are actually a lot of hidden costs associated with the use of this product. So if we burn fossil fuels, we know that causes warming. That then causes a melt in glaciers, which causes a rise in sea level, which then means that communities around the coast need to spend billions of dollars to upgrade their coastal infrastructure to deal with the impacts of burning fossil fuels. So that is sort of a cost that's been externalized, that's then borne by all of us, that's not reflected in the price of the product. And an economist will tell you that we need to internalize that cost. So There's some external costs, like perhaps upgrades to coastal infrastructure, to the extent that there's going to be more and more extreme weather and property damage that results. There's another cost. Maybe in certain parts of the world, it'll be harder to grow food, and so there's a hit to the agricultural sector. There's another hidden cost. Maybe there's health costs, and so on. So the costs go higher and higher. Through internalizing those costs by something like, say, a cap and trade regime or a carbon tax, these pricing mechanisms, you then communicate to markets the true cost of the product. And we collectively see, this particular solution is more costly than we assumed. We're now more interested in less costly alternatives. And that's how you facilitate a market shift. The interesting thing, of course, is it's one thing to price the concrete and rebar that goes into upgrading your coastal infrastructure, but how on earth do you price, say, a species that might face extinction? What about, to the extent that people are being uprooted from their homes because of, say, flooding or fires or all sorts of events that are exacerbated by climate change? What is the dollar value on that, on a person being displaced for their home? And I asked myself, have we come to this point in time, and this is to paraphrase Oscar Wilde, where we know the price of everything and the value of nothing? And I asked myself, what if there's another way to capture and communicate these externalities to market? And of course there is. So that's sort of a segue to our idea. What this approach does is it captures and communicates externalities in this quantitative way through the language of dollars and cents. What this approach does is it captures and communicates externalities in a qualitative way through the use of image and text. And so in the abstract, they're actually achieving the same thing. I think, though, on the ground, this has the potential to engage our sense of humanity much more than a 5-cent increase at the pump. I actually think that this might even be a more compelling intervention. And even if you don't accept that, I think what most people will agree on is this sort of intervention creates more political space, makes these sorts of interventions a little more palatable. So it takes the problem of externalities, and again, it communicates them, all for the low, low price of a sticker. All right, let's actually ground this in a study. So there are a bunch of studies that came out of Israel, actually, daycares in Israel, where they were finding that parents were coming late to pick up their kids. So parents had sort of a contract, an agreement with these daycares, dropping off our kids at 9, picking them up at 4, Monday to Friday. But there's this externalized cost that the daycare is having to provide, or rather bear, because the daycare provider is canceling their social plans, pushing back dinner plans, and so on, because the parents are coming late to pick up their kids. And so what these economists did is they said, okay, let's price these harms. Let's price this sort of external cost. And so if people are late to come to the daycare, they then have to pay a fine. And traditional economic thinking, sort of, the dominant paradigm suggests we're all these sort of selfish, self-interested creatures that might respond to changes in price like automatons say. That thinking suggests that we're then going to be incentivized to come more on time. What ended up happening, though, is curious. Parents actually came later to pick up their kids. And behavioral economists say that it's funny, the thinking switched. So now they're paying to come late. So you've kind of almost commodified lateness. And behavioral economists, they observe that in pricing things, sometimes you shut off these moral cues that otherwise regulate human relationships and so on. And the behavior then, it's justified. So we feel, I've paid for that. I feel justified in doing that. And so I think at the end of the day, that approach, if we rely solely on this approach, there's a risk that, might we do something like this and say, well, we've paid for it. I feel now justified in continuing in perhaps an unsustainable behavior. This kind of might be a safeguard against this. The other thing, too, worth considering, of course, is the price of gasoline varies. Right now, there's a glut, so oil's at a very low price. And, of course, gasoline now is inexpensive. And so this approach really kind of only works if the underlying price of the commodity is relatively high. That's when you'll see an impact. If the price of the commodity is quite low, it's not having much of an impact. So you could think of this intervention as being somewhat variable in nature. This, however, this is constant. It doesn't matter what the underlying price of the commodity is. it's always communicating these hidden costs, right? So this is sort of a variable intervention. This is a bit of a constant intervention. The other thing too worth pointing out, and this is sort of economics 101, a lot of people, a lot of economists will tell you that demand sort of responses to changes in price are fairly inelastic. And what that means is price goes up a little bit, price goes down a little bit, behavior actually doesn't change that much. What's curious though is in British Columbia, where we introduced a carbon tax, and I think it resulted in a few pennies per liter more expensive, is they found that it did have an impact. And what's really, really fascinating is the impact of the carbon tax was something like 7 times what we would see as a result of an equivalent increase in price just due to market conditions. So the impact of the carbon tax, the price of the product going up through that, roughly 7 times more than the impact of price going up just due to market conditions. And what's really, really interesting, and this was studied by a few academics in Canada, this is from an economist. He says, in general, this came from their study that found that effect. In general, people don't respond a heck of a lot to changes in gas prices, Dr. Schofela says. From the Globe and Mail, they wrote, the researchers believe the underlying reason for the price hike to benefit the environment is the reason why consumers change their driving behaviors. So it's really curious. There's more to it that's explored in the study, and I'd encourage you to read it. My point is quite simple. I think there's a lot to be said for these sorts of qualitative approaches, and I think sometimes we overestimate the impact of these approaches and underestimate the impact of these approaches. Regardless, though, even if you're not convinced, I think that this can very much be a gateway to that or a complement to that. So going to communications theory, Marshall McLuhan, of course, a famous communications theorist, also a Canadian, said, the medium is the message because it is the medium that shapes and controls the scale and form of human association and action. So people will sometimes tell me, they'll say, well, hey, Rob, I've seen this before in some other context. So I learned about this in a documentary, or I read about this in the newspaper, or I heard about it on a podcast. If you think about it, if you apply McLuhan's thinking, the medium is the message, all of those media, we sort of consume them as passive observers. So there it is, the things unfolding on the screen, and I'm nodding along saying, yeah, we really should do something about that problem. Or, I'm reading the newspaper, nodding along, yeah, we really should do something about that problem, or I'm seeing it, on my laptop, or hearing this information on a podcast. And so all of that, we consume that information as passive observers. What's interesting, though, is if you take Marshall McLuhan's "the medium is the message" and realize, well, this is the medium, the gas pump nozzle is the medium, is the message, we may have consumed this information through some other vehicle, but we've never actually consumed it quite in this way, where now I'm actually an active participant in this. So this approach, it transitions the person from passive observer to active participant. And from everything I've come across, everything I've read, change is much more fertile in this sort of a place as opposed to this sort of a place. So we're much, much more likely to change when we're kind of in this state. The other thing we're thinking too, so one, of course, it controls the form of human association, but 2, it controls the scale. So ask yourself, who's going to see these climate change documentaries, right? Who's buying climate change books? Who's seeing climate change in a headline in a newspaper article and reading it? By and large, it's the people that probably don't need to be consuming that information. So this actually accesses a whole bunch of people that aren't otherwise seeking this information. So it's interesting too in terms of scale as well. Another point to make is sort of climate change might also be, to a certain extent, we're learning more and more, a result, perhaps in part, of a failure of industry to disclose risk. So here are just a few recent headlines from the New York Times. ExxonMobil accused of misleading public on climate change risks. Vice News, meet the merchants of doubt who sow confusion about tobacco smoke and climate change. And this from The Guardian quite recently, oil industry knew of serious climate concerns more than 45 years ago. So we're learning more and more that industry may have actually known about the impacts of burning fossil fuels for quite some time. And in a lot of places in the world, several states in the United States, but also other countries now, several oil and gas companies are actually now under investigation for a potential failure to disclose risk. And so perhaps best case scenario, industry had some really relevant material, pertinent information and failed to disclose that to consumers. Worst case scenario, allegations are being made that they actively hid this information and perhaps may have be sort of disseminated doubt, misinformation, and so on to delay action on the problem. So the thing to do, really, in this situation of an industry that fails to disclose risk is to mandate a disclosure of risk. I would suggest that perhaps there's no better remedy for this kind of a situation than this. And if you're a lawmaker that's actually watching this, consider that, perhaps we have an industry that's failed to disclose a material risk to end users. And I would say that there is perhaps no more material risk than your product altering the basic chemistry of our planet. So it really is incumbent on lawmakers to pass legislation to then mandate disclosures of risk. So quick recap, think about it. A simple sticker, it's not a solution in and of itself, but if you understand the problem, if you break it down, you'll realize, yes, climate change is sort of a problem of no feedback. This actually builds feedback. Yes, it's kind of a problem of diffusion of responsibility. This locates responsibility. It's a problem of externalities or hidden costs. This communicates externalities. We're consuming this information as passive observers. This is a much more fertile place for change. And we have this kind of environment of a failure to disclose risk. There still is misinformation on climate change. Here is the remedy for that, sort of a mandated disclosure of risk. So the idea, hopefully at this point, and I'm actually now thinking of a prof where I gave a lecture to, at this point, she interjected and she said, "My goodness, why haven't we done this yet? It makes so much sense." So hopefully it's beginning to make a bit more sense. But I'll segue now into impact. So what do I actually think will happen as a result of these labels existing on pumps? And I think it's a disruptive innovation. And the story that I tell to illustrate this involves my mom. So I used to live downtown Toronto, and my mother lives uptown Toronto. Hi, Mom, if you ever find this on YouTube. And we often have breakfast together. So I was visiting her place for breakfast one morning. I noticed that the needle on her gas gauge was close to empty. So I figured that during the course of the day, she would gas up. And so I said to my mom, "Hey, we've been having such a great time hanging out together. How about I come over tonight for dinner?" And my poor mother thinks I'm this wonderful child that wants to spend time with her, but really I'm about to perform this experiment on her. So I end up coming back later in the evening, and before we sit down for dinner, I discreetly take her keys and I put them in the ignition of her vehicle, and I see the needle on the gas gauge go up to full. And so I know that during the course of her day, she gassed up. So I asked her over dinner, I said, "How was your day today? Where all did you go today?" And she says, "Oh, my day was great. I went to work, I got groceries, and then I came home." I said, "Oh, okay. Did you by chance stop anywhere else? Did you get out of your car for any other reason?" And she pauses, she reflects, and she says, "No, I went to work, I got groceries, and then I came home." And I began to sort of get narrower and narrower in my questioning. I say, "Think about your day really, really hard. Is there any reason, for any reason whatsoever, that you got out of your car even for a moment, other than going to work and getting groceries?" And again, she thinks about it and so on, and same old story, work, groceries, home. Eventually I asked, "Did you by chance stop at a gas station?" And she pauses and she reflects and she says, yeah, I did. Why?" And I think that perhaps might very well be what's at the core of our problem, this systemic inertia of the status quo that I referenced at the beginning. What you have on the demand side of the equation is this habitual, automatic, everyday, completely normalized behavior. It's something that we've done for a couple of generations now. It's just part of the everyday fabric of living. And as long as that's the situation downstream, and we're not saying, give me more oil, give me more fossil fuels, but as long as that's the situation downstream, as long as the everyday act of doing this is kind of almost this non-event, it's the perfect environment to perpetuate the status quo. And so what this does quite simply is it disrupts that. So what we're anticipating, and we have some anecdotal evidence anyway where we've kind of just shared the idea where this kind of is the response, We're anticipating the end user quite simply to say, well, but what am I supposed to do? What are my options, right? And so by doing that, I think you've kind of won. If you can get the person to question the status quo, if we've created a sense of dissatisfaction, discomfort around it, you're stimulating much broader demand for alternatives. So what you'll see are two things. You'll see sort of this individual change in behaviors and then this collective shift in attitudes. So this could take this everyday innocuous habitual behavior and now make me ask that question, well, what am I supposed to do? What are the alternatives? And so, of course, there will be a website hosted by the city, the province, the state, the nation, where these things exist, that has all of the different things that you could do as an individual to reduce your carbon footprint today. From more fuel-efficient driving techniques when it comes to, say, acceleration, deceleration, keeping your tires inflated, driving at a certain speed, and so on, to, did you know there's a great transit app or a great carpooling app? Or did you know here's this wonderful cycling infrastructure in your community? So, or, even did you know there's a rebate for electric vehicles? So all of these things that individuals can do, this is sort of then, it creates greater impetus for all those reasons I mentioned before to actually go and explore those options. So I think you'll see some individual behavioral change. Maybe it's even as simple as someone riding more public transit. Maybe it's something where we're even smarter trip planning. So I'm going to be on that other end of town next week. So I was thinking about going this week to run an errand, but it can wait. So because of this, we're now a little bit more mindful of this behavior. The other thing, though, that perhaps I think is more interesting is the shift in attitudes and what that enables. So if you can get people more broadly to question the status quo, as sort of we've frustrated the status quo, what you'll see is government with more political space to act, and you'll see business with more incentive to respond to a shift in demand. So if people start to say, but what are my options? What am I supposed to do? And so on. I mean, here in my city of Toronto, we often talk about the need for better public transit, but the conversation seems to break down around funding for public transit. If more and more people begin to say, and not just the typical kind of narrow environmentalists, but regular everyday folk, if they begin to talk to their councillors, their politicians, and say, but I would take public transit, but it's kind of awful. For the love of God, fund public transit. If they hear from more and more of these people, that then gives them more political capital to pursue those sorts of things. On the business side of things, the Ford Model T came off the assembly line in 1908. The internal combustion engine is all we've ever known, and that's, for the most part, what auto manufacturers have delivered to market. If you can signal to a producer that there's sort of discontent in a marketplace with the status quo solution, if you could signal to a producer that here's this segment of the marketplace that's not being catered to, they're interested in alternatives, there's then greater impetus for them to put a little bit of money into research and development, to perhaps retool their plant and so on, to deliver alternate solutions like electric vehicles and so on. And if you can signal to them broader market interests, they're then able to come out with those sorts of solutions in volume. That, of course, brings price points down. So the idea, essentially, it communicates hidden costs to end users that then actually drives change upstream. And just so you know, it's not just the story of my mother. This is from the leading behavioral economics think tank out of the United Kingdom. They say psychologists' theories on changing habits generally involve first unfreezing the subconscious action and raising it to a conscious level where we can consider the merits of alternative behaviors. So big picture, this is where we're at today. This is the status quo. This is where we need to transition to, the sort of sustainable future. But we really need to sort of unfreeze this. We need to create some discomfort, some dissatisfaction around it, to loosen the grip of the status quo, to better facilitate the transition. How does this idea fit with other campaigning? So, of course, there's a lot of action in Canada that are focused on points of extraction, like the oil sands or tar sands, focused on means of distribution, so pipelines, shipping, perhaps offshore drilling on the extractive side of things. There's this tendency for us to sort of upstream the problem. So we say the problem is over there. And in doing that, I think we create this distance. The objective of these labels, it's sort of to close the experiential gap between our burning of fossil fuels and their impacts, which is critical, I think, to making change. But the current narrative it's creating more of a gap. We're sort of creating this distance. And what I'm suggesting we do is, instead of reflecting the mirror upstream, imagine turning it and reflecting it downstream. So now I feel a little more connected to this problem. Now there's perhaps greater social impetus to address it. So I think it's critical that we begin to ask the simple question, how do we use fossil fuels? Moreover, if you're curious, where do the vast majority of emissions come from in this sector? This is a really important chart, and it might be small, but I'll share a link to it on YouTube. I think we could do this, right? I'm pointing at something now. Is this happening? Okay, go here. So this is what's called, think of it as a product life cycle analysis. So on this axis, you have a variety of sources of fuel, so a range from most carbon intense, Canadian oil sands, to least carbon intense. On this axis, you have what's called the well-to-wheel analysis. So well, point of extraction, to wheel, point of use. And so here are sort of carbon emissions closer to point of extraction, well, and then here, point of use. So let's compare Canadian oil sands to Canadian conventional crude. And many of us have heard that oil sands are 3 or 4 times as carbon intense or as dirty as regular oil. And when we look at that, yeah, that's kind of true, but it's only true of the sort of upstream sort of extraction and processing aspect. You have to take it as a percentage of the overall product life cycle. And that's when you realize, well, that's actually a small percentage of the overall product life cycle. And you might say, well, what is this blue stuff? Clearly, that's the vast majority of emissions. And it might be a bit small for you to read, but that says vehicle operation. So it's not taking the stuff out of the earth, which, by the way, has a lot of problems in and of itself, as does transporting the product. But when it comes to where do the vast majority of emissions come from, it's not that. It's not moving it to a point of consumption. It's all of us collectively basically lighting this product on fire. That's where the vast majority of emissions come from. And so the elephant in the room is kind of us. And so it's critical that we begin to sort of look at this. And let's say, this is interesting, so let's say, tomorrow we decide, industry, all of our political leaders and so on decide to shut down the oil sands, because that in Canada, of course, is where we tend to focus conversation when it comes to climate change. Let's say we actually shut it down and just use regular old conventional crude. The conversation is actually kind of about this, right? If we're using conventional crude, we still have to deal with that massive footprint. We have to deal with all of that. Interestingly, of course, there's only so much by way of efficiencies that you can squeeze out of the extractive side of things. There's lots and lots of room for gain here, particularly if you go to something like electric vehicles that might be fueled by renewables. If you go to electric vehicles, this then becomes zero. And then think about this upstream infrastructure. I mean, all of that stuff exists because there's a market for the product, right? If you dry up the market for the product, we're then actually dealing with a lot of this upstream infrastructure. There's less of a need for it. So it's critical that we begin to focus on the demand side of the equation, and this is something that can shift that conversation to this place. But don't take my word for it. This is the CEO of Shell, and I heard him in an interview recently where this was in Dutch, but there was a translation, and he was asked, well, what are you going to do in response to climate change? What are you going to do in response to COP21, this conference in Paris? And he says, well, I pump as much as I can to meet the demand. So there's a bit of a clue from the CEO of Shell. If we're actually to address the demand side of the equation, though perhaps maybe a little uncomfortable, because there might be a preference for us to sort of say, the enemy is over there, right? I, by the way, think that the enemy is sort of inertia. That's our greatest challenge, and this can kind of, disrupt that systemic inertia. But if we address the demand side of the equation, we're actually then addressing a lot of things upstream. One last point sort of on this, how disconnected are we? We don't even see the product. So this is a pump that was common in the 1920s and 30s. So over here, underneath the ground would be this tank of gasoline. There'd either be an electric motor or a hand pump that people can then use to sort of fill up this clear glass cylinder. And you fill it up as, to determine as much fuel as you like. And then there'd be a hose that would sort of flow down here. So you would actually see the product. And I think you would have some sense So sort of on the input side of things, you would see this product. You might say, well, where does it come from? You'd have some connection to sort of the input side of things. On the output side of things, you're putting this thing into your car week after week. Where does it all go? I keep on putting it in there and I keep on filling it up week after week. I think you'd have some sense of connection to emissions. As it is right now, we don't even see the product. And I think that's critical. I remember being on the highway in Toronto, the 401 near Yonge Street, where there's about 7 lanes going east and 7 lanes going west. And this was sort of at a point in the day where the roads were full of cars and the vehicles were sort of barely moving. And this was the summer of 2010 during the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico during this explosion. And for 3 months we saw as oil was sort of being spewed into the Gulf. And so I turned on the radio, there I was in traffic, and I turned it on to a program where the host, the guest, and the callers were all in unison saying, shame on BP, shame on British Petroleum. And I thought, if I could put on my X-ray vision, there I was on the highway, thousands and thousands of cars within eyesight in front of me and behind me, and there I am, with my X-ray goggles, and I could see that we're all sitting on gasoline that was refined from oil that had to come from somewhere underneath the earth. So there's this incredible disconnect. I think that's actually when it occurred to me that if we're to address this problem in a meaningful way, we need to close that experiential gap. We need to create more connection. This is sort of a new slide. I just inserted it though based on a question someone recently asked me. Think of this as sort of a thought exercise, right? So here you have city or place or planet A where these sorts of labels don't exist. Here you have place B where they do exist. So place A, there's a lot of systemic inertia, right? So the consumption of fossil fuels completely normalized. It's this automatic habitual behavior. There's this disconnect between cause and effect. There's sort of market complacency, and the problem is sort of constructed as being over there, right? Now imagine place B. Here's this thing where you've now denormalized the consumption of fossil fuels. You've taken this automatic habitual behavior, you've disrupted it, you've created some questioning around it. You've taken the situation of disconnect, now we're connecting the dots. You've taken this complacency, you've created a broader sense of dissatisfaction. The problem is now in part also understood as being over here. So there's a lot of inertia here. Here now, I think this place is ripe for reform. So ask yourself, in which place are governments and businesses more likely to accelerate the delivery of alternate solutions? Here or here? Clearly, the answer is here. And so I remember even hearing from a counselor not that long ago, he said, but we can't have these labels yet, because first we need better public transit, better cycling infrastructure, more affordable electric vehicles, and so on, and then we can get these labels. But I told him it's precisely because there are so few alternatives that we actually need these labels, because these are what create greater impetus for all of those solutions to come to market. So hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully you appreciate how this is actually where we want to be. This is a much better place to accelerate the change. And also ask yourself, this is coming down to the economic opportunity of it all, who's going to develop the solutions of tomorrow? So in which place do they make the investments today to then be leaders, to then develop the technologies and all sorts of solutions that tomorrow people want, right? So this place, they're likely to continue to develop products that nobody wants and down the road be net importers of solutions. This place, they're going to be ahead of the curve. They're going to be exporting solutions. They're going to be winning. So there's also this tremendous sort of economic opportunity here. You could think of this as being sort of an early market signal that might then result in a first mover advantage. How is industry responding to our campaign? So a few industry associations in the petroleum sector and also convenience stores, they're criticizing our messaging as being quote unquote negative and saying we need positive messaging. Like, for example, maintain tire pressure. So what we should have here, remove unused racks, slow down, and so on. And so we're going to be sharing this email with politicians all across Canada, rather this video, with politicians across Canada and the world. And so you might hear from industry that this is negative and we should go with something a bit more positive. But what I'll ask you to consider is, why does the fossil fuel sector want this messaging? And does it actually challenge the status quo, or does it further entrench it? Are these messages positive, or is it just avoidance? So I don't think 10, 20, 30 years down the road, we're going to have this conversation where we say, yeah, remember the greatest challenge of all time? We addressed it by removing unused roof racks, right? This kind of, it avoids the problem. And I think to the extent that it doesn't make the connection between our use of fossil fuels and their impacts, climate change and air pollution and so on, you're actually further entrenching the status quo. You're further normalizing it. And you're kind of really avoiding the problem. So I wouldn't actually characterize these as positive. I would characterize them perhaps more accurately as avoidance. And I think that, especially in the face of climate change, I think that's a negative thing. Or, as I like to call it, the strategy is keep calm because everything is awesome. This idea, it's actually, perhaps it's better characterized as being sort of this neutral conduit for information. This in itself isn't negative. It's sort of a shoot the messenger approach. What it's pointing at, what it's saying is negative, right? So it's actually climate change and so on. It's the impacts of burning fossil fuels. The other thing that I'd actually get you to consider, though, is maybe scratching the surface a little bit more. I think that these are negative, right? Because they're avoiding the problem. And that, I think, avoidance can be informed by the problem is too big. So despair, hopelessness, negativity, we can't address it. I'd rather not look at it, right? So think of the absence of labels altogether. I don't want to deal with this problem. Versus, this is informed by a sense of hopefulness, by a sense of positivity, by a sense of, well, let us have the courage to address this challenge. Let us face it head on, because I do believe that we can address it, right? So they're actually quite optimistic and positive. And I've talked to actually several youth across Canada who have conveyed to me the sentiment that what gives them hope is the idea that one day, if I see these on a pump, I will know that we're actually getting serious to deal with the challenge of climate change. If I don't see them on the pump, I think we're still not going to actually address the problem. If I see something like this, I think we're avoiding the issue. So this truly is positive. I think it's informed by hope. Where is the campaign at? So there's lots of progress actually in the United States, and kudos to my colleagues there that are working on this. In Berkeley, San Francisco, Santa Monica, and Seattle, the idea is all at various stages in the legislative process, and I'm optimistic that San Francisco will be moving on this soon. And this is a draft language for the label that's in the Berkeley Ordinance. It reads, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has determined that consuming energy products derived from fossil fuels contributes to climate change. To learn more, go to, and then there's a website. Industry response in the United States, they're framing it as compelled speech, that it's sort of challenging. They're going to make maybe a First Amendment challenge. That remains to be seen. We don't know. But counsel that we've talked to in the United States suggests that if you look at the test for compelled speech and infringement of freedom of speech, this is likely to sort of survive judicial scrutiny. So we're optimistic in that regard. The story in Canada, so in January of 2015, the municipality of West Vancouver, they passed a resolution unanimously calling on all vendors of retail petroleum products in Canada be legislated to provide warning labels on all pump handles. So by passing this resolution, they didn't actually pass the idea into law. They didn't actually implement it locally. You can think of it effectively as being an endorsement of the concept. So there's no real legal risk, political risk, or financial risk to kind of giving the thumbs up and maybe calling on other orders of government to implement it. And that ended up then taking off. So we had youth across Canada who we'd done groundwork in the prior years, and we've met lots of amazing youth across the country who were pitching it in their community. So here's 16-year-old Emily who pitched it. We have Emily and Brianna on the east coast of Canada who they pitched it to their councils. Josh in Guelph, so Guelph also passed a similar resolution. Mylène and Haley. Haley, of course, approached her council in Moncton, New Brunswick. They passed a resolution in support of the idea. So many other councils, too, some of them are listed on our website, have passed resolutions in support of the idea. As did the Union of British Columbia Municipalities, so the entire association of cities and towns across the province of British Columbia. at their annual conference in September of 2015, they voted, more than 50% of delegates voted in favor of this proposal. So we can now say it's the position of local governments across BC. And what ended up happening is you sort of had the municipality of North Vancouver in this environment where councils were sort of saying we should do this. They look left, they look right. And what they ended up doing is they passed it into law. And we have a 40-page legal report on our website that explores questions of jurisdiction. It's based on Ontario law, but we had it adapted to BC. And there's a law firm in British Columbia, a mid-sized, actually local government firm, did a review of our legal research and found a compelling argument for municipal jurisdiction. So I encourage you to look that up. In-house counsel, of course, reviewed the report as well, came to the same conclusion. And on November 16th, the city of North Vancouver became the first jurisdiction in the world to pass this into law, which is incredibly exciting. Their mayor said, "It is 2015 and we need to talk about how we are going to move forward as a society on a reduced carbon or carbon-free diet, and it's going to be a challenge," right? So here we are honestly facing this challenge and having that conversation, as uncomfortable as it might be, but that's actually where growth lies, I think, right? So again, as I mentioned before, complacency, complacent markets don't really drive change upstream. A little bit of discomfort with the status quo is a good thing. That's when you'll see reforms come about. The idea made headlines across North America and even the world. So it was in CTV, it was on Global News, CBC News, the Globe and Mail, cigarette package style labels on gas pumps aimed at making Canadians understand consequences. Vice. Hey, Stefan. All right. City Lab, which is a publication of The Atlantic. Climate change warnings for gas pumps are coming to Canada. Business Insider. Gasoline pumps and cigarette packs are about to have a lot more in common. This is from Univision, which I think is the #1 Spanish-speaking media group in the United States, and I apologize for my Spanish. Mangueras de gasolina con mensajes como los del tobacco. I can't speak Swedish, but this is from Swedish media. Bensinmacker far varningstexter om klimathotet. This from the Telegraph, which is the #1 daily paper in the Netherlands. Warning schwung stickers op benzinpump. And so thank you, by the way, I don't speak Dutch, but it's, so the thing made headlines all over the world, and I followed it on social media. People were tweeting about it, sharing it on Facebook, and so on. And so I do think that this thing will go global, and it will with your help. What we have here, top half, this is a map of all the places in the world. I got it off a tobacco control website. I think it's a little out of date, but essentially, tobacco warnings exist on packaging all over the world. And so the concept, this is from cognitive psychology. It's kind of this, we've been cognitively primed for it. The idea, it's familiar. This idea is evocative of that. And so we randomly get emails from Brazil, from Australia, from different parts of the world. People say, oh, this kind of reminds me of what we do with our tobacco packages. How do we get this done here? And there are some similarities. We burn fossil fuels today, but the consequences aren't experienced largely until down the road. Let's bring those faraway consequences into the here and now. Similarly, if you smoke a cigarette today, you'll probably be okay. Down the road, there's a lot of consequences. So we bring those faraway consequences more into the here and now. What's interesting, though, is to the extent that the harms from this product through secondhand smoke and so on, yes, perhaps others experience it, but by and large, it's the individual harming themselves. With here, this is a behavior where we actually all collectively experience the harm. So I would even argue, if you're comparing them, and I could get into that a little bit more, but I think there's a stronger public health rationale for these sorts of risk disclosure labels than there actually is for this. In any event, the bottom half, this is from a website that was hosting some of our content. These are Google Analytics. And notice, people from all over the world have actually been coming to our website and learning about our website. Apart from media in North America, the idea is now in a textbook in France. I've been interviewed by Deutsche Welle, which is Germany's #1 international broadcaster. It's in a forthcoming textbook in Australia. It's actually, how bizarre is this, the same consumer behavior textbook I studied in undergrad. The most recent edition will actually have this. So the idea is taking off. And what I think it'll have, the impact, this is from Donella Meadows. She's a scientist and educator who did a lot of work on systems change and systems theory. She does work on did work on what's known as leverage points, which are places within a complex system, a corporation, an economy, a living body, a city, an ecosystem, where a small shift in one thing can produce big changes in everything. And I think what we've identified here is a leverage point. If you're a sailor, of course, you'll know this sort of trim tab analogy, right? So think of it as a rudder within a rudder. And so you might have a ship that has a lot of inertia to it, right? Going in a specific direction. And it would take a lot of energy. It'd take a lot of power to move the entire rudder to get that ship going in a different direction. What the trim tab does, though, it's this tiny rudder within the rudder. It creates this sort of negative space with pressure that then allows the big rudder to come along to swing around much, much more easily using a lot less energy. And of course, then the ship is able to then change trajectory. There's a great analogy there, which you should be able to get the metaphor. It's pretty obvious. We need to change the trajectory, the course of the ship. And I think this creates an ideal social environment. This is a bit of a trim tab, a leverage point that'll enable us to do it. So that's it. There's a lot more resources on our website. Where to go from here? If you're a citizen, advocate for it. Don't reinvent the wheel. Take everything off our website, make it your own. Take this video, so hopefully it's informative enough, and tell your politicians, tell your local politicians, your MPs, your MPPs, your state, your national politicians, and so on. Say, look, watch this video. It's only perhaps an hour long. Make some popcorn. The idea is more interesting than you'll think. Please watch this. And I don't have too much resources at my disposal to advocate for this. But if you take this, if you make it your own, in all of these instances where resolutions were passed in support of the thing, it was always just one or two teenagers for the most part that were able to move it forward. So please take this idea and advocate for it. Two, if you're a politician, don't wait to have citizens advocate for it. Talk to your colleagues, talk to your fellow lawmakers, get this thing on your agenda, get a bill passed, get this thing passed into law. For the Canadian audience, of course, there are a few provinces where municipalities might not have the power to do this because you have older legislation governing municipal laws and so on. A lot of provinces, of course, do have these powers. So what I would ask you to do is to either A, pass a resolution in support of the concept, because that then results, I think, in a more fruitful conversation at other orders of government, creates more of a say, a social environment where the idea is a bit more palatable. But if you do have the authority to pass this into law, as a lot of research suggests is the case, then please do it. This is the greatest challenge of our time. This is an absurdly simple idea. It's just a sticker, this rubber piece that kind of fits on the nozzle. I was able to purchase it for $16. So even if a lot of pumps aren't yet really yet outfitted with this, it's a very small expense for the retailer actually to pick up. And the other thing I'd sort of get you to think about is put this thing into perspective, right? It's actually not all that interventionist. It's actually fairly, it's I think one of the least restrictive interventions there are out there. So if you're to rank order all the interventions that one can take to address this thing called climate change, from stopping extraction of fossil fuels altogether, say shutting down the oil sands, as many are asking for, or no more pipelines, so no more permits for pipelines, to perhaps requiring the auto sector to only manufacture electric vehicles, or mandating if you're a gas station, you need to have one or two, or three electric chargers for all the gas pumps that you have. Something like that. Somewhere along the line, perhaps I think at the very bottom is put a sticker on a pump, right? So it's so inexpensive, it's so simple, yet paradoxically, I think it's an incredibly compelling intervention. And I asked myself, what can we do that's least restrictive, that's least interventionist than this? I think nothing. So if you're failing to do this, we really need to ask ourselves, well, what on earth are we doing to mitigate? What on earth are we doing to address what many have described as being the greatest challenge of our time? So please join the communities that are already showing the way. Have the courage, show the leadership to actually implement this, pass this into law. And I think if globally, the more and more that this continues to spread, then that provides more and more examples for others to follow. And imagine if you can make this problem of climate change a little more tangible, a little more real, a little more proximate. I think you're creating the ideal social environment that means then we'll finally address the problem in a more meaningful way. And the last thing I need to do, I'm terrible at asking for money, which is why I'm frankly flat broke, is to ask for money. If you are an individual and you make donations to organizations, please go to our website. There's a crowdfund. It's a monthly crowdfund. It's called a patron campaign. And donate $1, $2, $5, $10 if you think it's a good idea. We have a very, very small budget, and everything that you're able to contribute actually does help us go a long way. I, for example, I'm not even paid. We don't have any paid staff, and I've been volunteering my own time and my own resources to make this thing happen. So I really, really appreciate your support, and got to throw it out there because there are some billionaires on the planet. Fingers crossed. If you know a billionaire or a multi-millionaire that likes to donate to environmental groups, send this to them. One of our challenges is because we engage in political advocacy, I can't get charitable status in Canada without going all into details into the laws. It then makes it incredibly challenging for us to get funding. We can't get access to money from foundations, say we can't issue charitable tax receipts and so on. But if there's a philanthropist out there, if you know of one that might be interested in supporting this project, please do forward this. A little bit of money with us, I think, would go a very, very long way. I think you would find a great return on investment here. We also have some other interesting ideas that we want to pursue, but we don't have the budget or team to do it. So I can't issue you a tax receipt, but by goodness, I think we'll make a really, really good impact here. So get in touch if you can support us, or go directly to ourhorizon.org/donate. I think that is all. Thank you very much. Please direct questions. You can find our contact info at the website. Communications@ourhorizon.org is probably the best bet. Thanks for your time.